To support this Wild World podcast, please check out Autio. It's an app that gives you amazing stories told by some of the world's best storytellers, such as John Lithgow, Phil Jackson, and Kevin Costner, and it's uniquely curated based on your location. It's a perfect audio travel companion for any road trip or just learning more about a trip you want to take. Click on the link in our show notes for more information.
Chimpanzees are our closest living relatives. In fact, chimps are more closely related to you and I than they are to other apes like gorillas. That means that we can learn a lot about ourselves by studying chimpanzees. But to really learn the secrets of these amazing animals, you can't just watch them in a zoo. You have to venture out to where they live.
It's just so hot. It seems like there'll never be rains again. And just to hear the thunder is just amazing. And in one case, it was when David was alpha male. We heard thunder, and I believe it was probably for the first time that year. And David started screaming, not just panhooting, but screaming in excitement. And the other individuals were screaming too. And it was just, oh, yeah. I mean, you literally felt like screaming along.
Woo! This is Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon. In this episode, we're trekking out into the hot, dry savanna in the West African nation of Senegal to visit some of our distant family members. Studying animals in the wild gives us insights into their behaviors that we could never get from observing animals in captivity. Jane Goodall's work with wild chimpanzees in Tanzania in the 1960s was groundbreaking in many ways. No one had ever gotten wild chimpanzees to trust them enough to allow close observation of what they do. And although people had studied captive chimpanzees for decades, she saw chimps doing things that had never been seen before. Her work revealed that wild chimpanzees have much more complex and sophisticated behaviors than people had previously thought. That was true of both their individual behaviors, like chimpanzee fishing for termites with a stick, but also their social interactions. But Jane Goodall's work also proved that it was possible for wild chimpanzees to become habituated to the presence of humans. And that paved the way for other researchers to do the same. Researchers like Dr. Jill Pruetz. In 2001, Jill Pruetz began studying wild chimpanzees in the West African nation of Senegal. Unlike Jane Goodall's Tanzanian chimpanzees, which live in a forest, Senegal's chimps live in the savanna, where it's hot and dry. While several other groups of forest chimps had been habituated since Jane Goodall's work in the 1960s, no one had successfully habituated savanna chimps. Until Jill Pruetz did. And her work would reveal that savanna chimps are quite different from forest chimps. In addition to publishing dozens of research papers about chimps and other primates, Jill Pruetz is also the author of several books, including her latest, Apes on the Edge, Chimpanzee Life on the West African Savanna, published by the University of Chicago Press. I visited her at her home in the Texas countryside, where she has a small farm with a couple of cows and horses as well as some dogs. She grew up nearby and went to Texas State University for her undergraduate degree. She then went to the University of Illinois, where she got her PhD in anthropology. Incidentally, I was there at the same time studying biology and anthropology, although we never met. She got a faculty position at Iowa State University, where she spent a few years before coming back to Texas State University in 2017. She now holds the title of Regents Professor of Anthropology. Jill Pruetz, thank you so much for inviting me to your home to talk about your work with chimpanzees. I want to start by jumping back in time to May 2006. You were at your field site, Fungoli, in Senegal, and you were watching a chimpanzee named Tumbo when it did something rather unusual. Can you walk me through what you saw?
So Tumbo at that time was an adolescent female, and she started making a tool. And so what she did was she broke off a live tree branch. She started taking all the leaves off the branch. She trimmed all the twigs off the side branches and broke off the flimsy tip. And Tumbo, when she makes this type of tool, she actually removes all the bark. So she's one of the few chimps that removes all the bark from the tool. And then she bites the end of it. I say trims the end of the tip and makes it sharp. And I saw her make this tool, and I was like, I know she's going to do, where is she going? She's going to do something. What is she going to do? And so I abandoned my subject, which is what I do when stuff like this happens. And I left my subject that I was following, and I followed Tumbo. And she actually went and started hunting a bush baby, which is a type of primate, with this tool that she had made. And that behavior is relatively unique among chimpanzees. You don't see this type of behavior anywhere else but Fongoli, at least like at the rate that we see it at. And females like Tumbo, adolescent females and adult females, are the ones that engage in this behavior more than any other age sex class, like adult males, which are usually the main hunters. So it's pretty fantastic. And it really caused me to shift my research focus. So I'm very much interested in behavioral ecology. And I went out with questions about feeding and food availability. And that's still something I focus on. But then these chimps at Fongoli do things like make tools to hunt other mammals with, and use caves, soak in water, and dig wells for water. And so it's really caused me to shift my focus over the years according to what they do. And it's been so very much like a natural history study in many respects. And it's been so interesting to just, let them kind of guide our research. But that's probably been what most people think is the most exciting finding out of the Fongoli study site.
I mean, it's incredible to think of a chimpanzee hunting with basically like a spear, right? I mean, they're making a tool, like you said, and fashioning it to use it for a particular purpose. And that's really unusual, right? I mean, some chimpanzees are already known to use a stick to go sort of fishing for termites, right? Sticking a stick into a termite mound or an ant nest and to get the termites out. But this was a really unusual thing to see them actually hunting, right?
Yeah, I mean, the hunting with tools was something really until that time. I think that was another characteristic we used to define our own species. We hunt with tools. Other animals don't hunt with tools. There might be, one example in chimpanzees elsewhere, what have you, but that's something that humans do. And it turns out that it's something you see often at Fongoli. So we've got between 500 and 600 cases, probably close to 600 now. It's something you see every year. There's like a season for bush baby hunting. And we're still kind of trying to figure out why that is, but I think it has to do more with the bush babies themselves and their behavior, these little primates, than the chimpanzees. I think they would probably hunt bush babies all year round. And it's the females, the adult females and the adolescent females that are doing this behavior more often. And that's also not a chimpy type of behavior, because in chimps, adult males are the ones that are the most prolific hunters at all of those study sites. And at Fongoli, the males in general hunt more than females as well. But when it comes to the spear hunting, the tool-assisted hunting, it's the females that are doing it. And
because normally chimpanzees that have been observed hunting elsewhere, they just hunt with their hands, right? Or their teeth, I guess, right? I mean, not with tools.
Right. Yeah. So it's basically you're running down your prey, grabbing it and dispatching it. Oftentimes with your teeth. Sometimes, monkeys have a handy tail, so they use that tail as a lever and they kill it by hitting its head on something hard. And I've seen that with bush babies too, which I think is kinder to the prey. But at any rate, it's just, not this run down and grab. And archaeologists and paleoanthropologists that have talked to you about this behavior have really identified the fact that you're removing kind of that heightened state from hunting. And so if you think about running down a prey item, it is like an aggressive behavior. I mean, your level of excitement, your state is very different from using a tool to basically distance yourself from the prey item. And even though bush babies sound, they're, not very big.
It's a small primate.
It's a very small primate.
Like, about
yes.
how big is it?
So it's a bush baby. I think it's about the size of a guinea pig, not maybe as heavy as a guinea pig. And it's only active at night. So during the day, it's not very well equipped to be out in the sunlight. It has a very long tail. But it hops. So it has really long legs, and it has this amazing ability to hop like up to 5 feet, off the ground or between trees, and more, I'm sure, between trees. But it's a diminutive prey item. But I have seen chimpanzees abandon hunts because they were going to get bitten by a bush baby. And I actually I gave a talk at a museum once, and I had someone that studies big cats talk to me, because I've had the question over the years of, is that really hunting? Isn't it like termite fishing? And it's really not. So there's different challenges. The bush babies don't grab onto the tool and let themselves be pulled out. Even though the injury might be small compared to something like a monkey, the chance for infection is always a real risk. And so this person that studied big cats talked about leopards, for example, and said, leopards are very risk aversive. A lot of animals are risk aversive. These hunters that could, for example, animals that prey on, so leopards and baboons. Leopards prey on baboons, but yet they'll abandon a carcass to a group of baboons because they're averse to being injured. And so that seems to be the same case with the chimps. I mean, a bush baby bite is not going to be life-threatening right then, but it could be in a couple of days, because infection is such a real risk in any type of environment. So to me, the bush baby hunting is challenging. Not only do you have literally an extractive foraging technique, because you have a hidden prey item.
Hidden in like a hole in the tree.
Yeah. So the bush babies nest, they spend the day when they're not active. They're active at night. They spend the day in these cavities. It's either a hollow tree or a hollow branch. And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes a chimp can't reach its hand into this cavity. Sometimes they can. But again, I've seen a chimp go to reach their hand in the cavity and jerk it back, because they don't want to get bitten by a bush baby. And in one case, there was 3 different chimps tried to get at this bush baby, and they abandoned the hunt. And in rare cases, I'm able to climb up and look into the cavity. Yeah, I'm not a very good climber. The Jacques who worked with me on a bush baby project, he's one of my researchers in fungal. He's great at climbing. But I climbed up, and I could see this very angry bush baby with its mouth open.
Oh my gosh.
And there was little, I have to say, superficial, I'd like to think there were little places, wounds on its head where the spear had caught it. But this cavity was configured so it could like hide underneath this shelf of wood. And so the chimps couldn't get to it without getting bitten. So especially one of the last chimps to try was an adolescent male, and his hand would fit in there. My hand would have fit in there. His hand's bigger than mine, but his hand would have fit in there, but he wouldn't risk it. And so it's really interesting to me then. So you have this prey that's hidden, but then it's also a prey that's actively trying to bite you. And so to me, it's a different challenge than termite fishing and ant dipping, but it is, an extractive type of foraging. But especially when we first reported it, I'm not sure why people were so reluctant to accept it as something that actually happened. I think because it's that idea that we hunt with tools.
Yeah.
These guys can't hunt with tools.
Right. That's our thing.
Yeah, right. But, if you look at chimpanzee behavior, it's not that much more complex than many other behaviors. And there's more complex tool use that they exhibit at other sites when they're trying to get into a termite mound, where they have to take different steps to at least access the termites and then make a tool to, fish the termites out. So it's not as complex, probably, I would say, as stone tool use at other sites where they have to crack open nuts and have specific hammer and anvils. But it's something we're looking at. Actually, I have a graduate student now that's looking at developmental process associated with the tool use. They're still dependent on mom, but that's when we first see them trying to hunt. They will make a tool. They'll go through all the steps, and there's at least 5 steps that they have to go through. They'll go through all these steps, and they'll make this tool that's about the size of a pencil. It's a perfect fit for this baby hand, but it will not do anything as far as a bush baby goes. Yet they're so earnest in trying to use this tool in a cavity, and it takes them another 3 or 4 years to move away from that that inadequate tool to start experimenting. Really, I think it's trial and error at this point, different lengths of tools. The average tool is about 70 centimeters in length. Sometimes you'll have a tool that's over 1.5 meters long, and you can't even get it into the cavity. It breaks and everything like that. Then finally, when they're adolescents, they get to a point where they're making this kind of appropriate tool length. And that depends on the cavity as well. But, there's a range. And so that to me is really interesting. So this student's going to look at, the types of learning they're involved and look at, for example, if your mother is a good hunter, does that mean you're going to be a good hunter? And so there's a number of different things that she's going to look at. I'm really excited about that to see.
That's super interesting how they're learning how to do this behavior.
You're listening to Wild World. After a quick break, we'll hear about some other surprising behaviors Jill Pruetz and her team have observed while studying wild chimpanzees in Senegal. Hi, I'm Scott Solomon. As a scientist and world traveler, I spend a lot of time on the road. And I wanted to share with you an app that can make that time more exciting, educational, and more interactive than your typical audiobook or podcast. Except for this one, of course. It's called Audio. That's AUTIO. And what it does is it uses GPS to follow your location, and then it gives you audio stories about the places that you're driving by. These stories are told by some of the best storytellers out there, like John Lithgow, Phil Jackson, Kevin Costner, and many others. The stories are short, usually about 3 to 5 minutes long, and they play for you as you drive. Or, if you prefer, you can plan a road trip and then find stories about those places to inspire you before you leave. And Audio's library of stories celebrate every voice and perspective. Rooted in curiosity, the storytelling embraces the diversity of cultures, people, and places that you discover along your travels, just like we do here on Wild World. Stories are updated and added every week, so no two journeys are ever the same. Now you can check out the audio app through a link on our website, wildworldshow.com, or in the podcast show notes. And by doing so, you'll also help our podcast to continue to bring you explorations of the natural wonders of the world and the voices of the people who explore, study, and protect them. Welcome back. I'm Scott Solomon, and I'm speaking with primatologist Jill Pruetz about her work with savanna chimpanzees in West Africa.
So if it's successful, like they're jabbing this tool down into this cavity and there's a bush baby in there, are they actually like spearing it? Is that what happens? Or are they killing it and they reach in and grab it? Or how does that work?
So I think, when we first published the first paper about it, we had like 22 cases or something. And it definitely is, they're jabbing it in there as if you're spearing something. But they're not skewering it. And there was one headline when we first reported that there were so many headlines. I was on the phone all day long. It was interesting. A lot of pushback too. But there was one article, and it was a great article, but the title of it was Chimps Snack on Skewered Bush Babies, which is absolutely not. No one's ever said that. We've never seen it.
Not a bush baby kebab or something like that.
Exactly.
No. Yeah.
So, clickbait or whatever. And then, that just kind of gets stuck in people's heads.
Yeah.
But we've never seen that. What we have seen, it's a combination of rousing a bush baby and perhaps wounding it as well. The thing is that we have seen when they have really stabbed the bush baby to the point where they've killed it, then they can't get it out.
Mm.
And that may have been the case where they've killed a bush baby before and can't get it out. It's very hard to see what happens once they get it because it's fast. It's over usually fast. But I have to say that sometimes you can see that the bush baby is still alive because of the tail. It's over very quickly because, then there's a bite and that's it. But I don't think they're trying to kill it in the cavity because it's hard to extract it. I think in large part it's trying to rouse it out of that cavity so they can grab it. But also if I was the chimp, wounding it to some degree is also beneficial because there are often times that the bush baby escapes. And once a bush baby's out of there, it's hard to catch. It's hard to run down a bush baby.
So they want it to come out, but maybe injured.
Yes, and be able to catch it. And we've seen it quite a bit. We filmed it quite a bit now. And there's definitely cases, if you slow it down, that the chimp sees the bush baby coming, they drop the tool and they can grab it. But in December, when I didn't expect to see hunting, because it's not that time of year, we actually saw bush baby hunting. And it was good old Farafa, who is one of my favorite chimps. She's probably in her 50s, if not more, but at least in her 50s. She can't see really good right now. And she actually lagged behind the rest of the group. So we were following Farafa, and it's December. We hardly see any bush baby hunting at that time. But sure enough, Farafa goes up this tree and she starts making a tool. So I was able to film it. And the bush baby ends up getting away. But what was interesting was in this case, there was 2 exits or entries for the bush baby. And we've seen this in other cases too. And what happens is the chimps are stabbing their tool into one cavity entrance and then putting their foot over the other. So
they know that there's another exit hatch.
The bush baby can't get out, but it did get out. So, I like to think that, her vision, and she is getting old, but she's still faster than me, but at any rate, it was a real treat to see that.
So why do they mostly hunt the bush babies that time of year?
What it seems pretty simple, but the fact that these bush babies are nesting in cavities indicates that they are trying to avoid chimpanzee predation, because this PhD student that studied the bush babies also studied them in Tanzania. And in Tanzania, you don't find as much cavity nesting. So they nest in vine tangles or acacia trees and things like that. Fungolia almost purely cavity nesters. But what happens during a rain is those cavities actually get inundated with water. And the bush babies, I think, are more accessible. What you'll see after a rainstorm is immediately the chimps will go out into the woodland and start looking for cavities, for bush baby cavities. So I think it's basically, access to bush babies.
Kind of flooding them out, basically.
Yes.
Like they can't go as deep.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then, I had, the Jacques Keita works for me in Fungolia, and he's the tree climbing expert. And so we did a bush baby study a few years ago where I put temperature loggers in the cavities as well, and, measured water inundation. So that's something that we're still working up to look at, basically what happens to these cavities. I used a borescope, which is a tool that a plumber uses to look into pipes and things.
Oh, it's like the camera?
Yes. So we used a couple of borescopes actually we used to look at what a cavity, looked like from the inside. Because like I said, with the one bush baby, he was in this cavity that the chimps couldn't, he could sit under this shelf of wood and they didn't have access to him. And you'll see that a lot of times chimps will tear off pieces of wood if they can. In this case, he chose wisely because they couldn't get to him in that case. But I will say that one thing we've seen that is also related to the gold rush in Senegal is that bush baby hunting has declined over the past few years. And this summer, I'm going to go out with a graduate student to look at bush baby density, because what's happened is the first tree that people came in and illegally logged is the main species that bush babies sleep in terms of these cavities. So the large individuals of that tree species are gone, except in certain places or where that tree is not straight enough. They're making 6-foot planks out of this tree. Mm-hmm. But that's something we're going to look at. And I was surprised to see the decline. There was a decline by about 50% in bush baby hunting over the past few years.
So one of the things that's really unique and interesting about Fungolia, as opposed to other places that people have studied chimpanzees, is that this is a savanna ecosystem, right? Mm-hmm. It's different from the kinds of forest or rainforest environments that chimpanzees have been studied in other places, right? So, of course, Jane Goodall famously studied chimpanzees and really sort of was the pioneer for studying chimpanzees in the wild, right? Mm-hmm. And so it seems like a lot of the keys to understanding the behavior of chimpanzees at Fungolia has to do with the fact that it's a savanna ecosystem. And I know you've also documented the way that they react to water and use water as being unusual among chimpanzees, or at least different from forest. Can you talk a little bit about how they use water and how important water is for them?
Yeah, and probably if you ask people to study chimps, the Fongoli chimps' use of water is probably more surprising than any other behavior, because we, for years, described chimps as being almost hydrophobic, afraid of water, based on Jane Goodall's work at Gombe, where chimps really avoided water. And since then, we know that captive chimps can enjoy water, captive chimps that live in Texas, other places, and that at other sites in the wild, they will, even wade into water a little bit to get a water plant or something. But at Fongoli, they are soaking in water. They're seeking water out for recreation, literally. And it's something that they compete over. So at the beginning of the rainy season, these rock pools that have formed over eons will fill up with water because you'll have a big storm and this water runoff comes from a plateau, fills up the pool, and the chimps will compete over who gets to get in the water, sit for a few minutes, get back out, repeat dozens of times a day at this really hot and humid time of year. It's like 123 degrees, 124,
Wow.
something like that. So it's pretty stifling.
Yeah.
So you see a lot of soaking behavior then by the chimps.
So
and then
cooling off in the water, taking a bath. Yeah.
Exactly. And so it makes perfect sense. Like if you didn't have this idea about chimpanzees, then you would think, well, of course that makes sense. I mean, I want to go soak in the water, right? But yeah, it really is a different type of behavior for chimps.
Yeah, that's really cool. And you've written in your book about how excited the chimpanzees get sometimes when those rains begin at the beginning of the rainy season, right?
Yeah. So one thing that happens is a lot of times you'll hear thunder before the storms ever come in, and it's coming from the south. So you can hear these thunderstorms, miles away that may not arrive for days. But when you hear that thunder at the end of the late dry season, chimpanzees will pant hoot. And when they pant hoot, it's this very loud call. If you ever heard a chimp call, you've heard a pant hoot. And we call it a chorus because everyone's pant hooting together and it's just this excitement. So they pant hoot sometimes when they see someone they haven't seen for a while. They'll pant hoot when they reach a feeding tree. But yeah, so they'll pant hoot in response to thunder. So to me, it's so exciting too because I am especially miserable in April. It's just so hot, and it's so hot at night, so hot during the day. It's so bleak. It seems like there'll never be rains again. And just to hear the thunder is just amazing. And in one case, it was when David was alpha male. We heard thunder, and I believe it's probably for the first time that year. And David started screaming, not just panhooting, but screaming in excitement. And the other individuals were screaming too. And it was just, oh, yeah. I mean, you literally felt like screaming along. It's hard not to join in sometimes because it's like,
the
oh
rain is coming. It's going to cool off.
It is.
That's so exciting. And you mentioned that they sometimes use caves. Is it mainly just to go in there to cool off?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the first things that I learned about the chimps when I started working in Senegal, and again, before they were habituated, was that my head field guide and researcher in Buli Kamra told me that they use caves. So he was showing me around. He'd take me to find nests. We record nests and different things. And he said, the chimps use this cave. And my French was even worse at that point. So I'm like, I had to make him repeat it several times. And it's like, okay, this sounds like a dream come true.
You weren't sure you were correctly understanding him when he said that? You thought, yeah, right.
Exactly. It's like, okay, chimps use caves. I'm sure he got annoyed at me asking to repeat it and, saying it so many different ways. He's like, oh, yeah, because, of course they use caves here. This is a cave they use. And as an anthropologist, that was just fantastic. Cave use, oh my gosh.
Because it reminds you of like what we think about ancient humans using caves, right? I guess, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it was very exciting. The chimps weren't habituated though, so we couldn't follow them into caves. So we put up camera traps in the cave. Well, the chimps avoided them. And over time though, they got used to camera traps. So we've got quite a bit of footage of them in the caves. And then once they were habituated, we were able to follow them to the caves, observe them going in, and then observe them going out. So these are not very big caves. They're always a stable temperature, more stable than the outside temperatures, and they're cooler than the outside temperatures. So this was definitely a place that they'll go to cool off. So they use it during the dry season months. Once the wet season kicks in, they'll stop using the caves. And it's kind of clammy in there, more snakes and things. And they'll take food in there. They'll groom in there. Again, there's a hierarchy. So the dominant males will have priority access to the caves. A lot of times you'll find the older females or females with infants that are stressed by, dehydration, things like that. They'll be in the caves.
Let's take another quick break. When we come back, we'll hear about how savanna chimps react to wildfires.
To support this Wild World podcast, please check out Autio. It's an app that gives you amazing stories told by some of the world's best storytellers, such as John Lithgow, Phil Jackson, and Kevin Costner, and it's uniquely curated based on your location. It's a perfect audio travel companion for any road trip or just learning more about a trip you want to take. Click on the link in our show notes for more information.
This is Wild World. My guest is anthropologist and primatologist Dr. Jill Pruetz.
So one of the other things that's unusual about being in a savanna ecosystem is having fire be a more common thing that happens, right? Compared to being in a rainforest. So how do the chimpanzees react when there's a fire?
So at Fongoli, at least 75% of their home range is burned annually. So it's usually fires that are started by people, and then once a fire starts, it just goes on and on and on. They're not big barriers to stopping the fire, but it is a fire adapted landscape. So it's, part of the ecosystem. The chimps are remarkably calm around fire. Even what I call, dangerous kind of fires. So fires start around December. That's when you have most fires, and that's the early dry season. If you get a fire in March or April, that's the late dry season, it is especially destructive, so that it can destroy even these fire-adapted trees, other types of vegetation. And the vegetation is so dry that it is more kind of a fire we think about when we have wildfires in the States nowadays, and they're very dangerous, destructive fires. The chimps are even pretty calm around the destructive fires, and they seem to be really good at navigating around fires. And a lot of times they'll just wait for a fire to actually move before they continue. So they can predict basically where the fire is going to go. So I've seen in one case chimps wait until this fire kind of burns out before they continued on their way across the plateau rather than going around. And at the edges of the fire, you had flames that were pretty small, maybe a few feet tall, but they could jump up to 3 or 4 feet. And the chimps were grooming, and they seemed like they weren't even watching the fire. I'm sure somebody was watching it, right? But there was at one point, a male was lying down, and there was flames about 3 feet from his head. He seemed to not care whatsoever.
Wow.
And so I think they're really good at judging potential sources of the fire. Whereas I am in a panic almost always when there's a fire around and it's close to me.
Yeah, it was scary.
Yeah. And this, smoke, etc. But I've been with the chimps when they've been around a late season fire that is really destructive. And that's when I first started thinking more about the fire. And they were very reluctant to move away from this destructive fire. So this fire was along the bottom of a dry creek bed where you have these really tall elephant grasses, and they're incredibly dry. Hadn't been burned yet. So the flames were probably maybe not 10 meters high, but I would say 8 to 10 meters high.
Oh my gosh, that's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot of fire.
Yeah. So, and you can hear the fires coming from a long distance. And when I hear a fire, immediately I start thinking about, where I'm going to go. A lot of times, though, you hear this almost constantly during the dry season, certain days. And so the chimps just ignore it. And they seem to also understand how far that is, or they're able to detect how far a fire is and where it might come. So there's been times when I've left the chimps at the end of a day, I hear a fire, I can see the glow, and I'm like, well, they're not going to be here in the morning because the fire's coming. And it doesn't. It goes somewhere else. I don't know, but they know about fire, and they live with it all the time. But in this one case where there was this very dangerous fire, some of the behaviors were really interesting to me. And so then we started looking at these encounters more closely and looking at their use of a burn landscape. In this case, it was the peak of the dry season. It was the hottest time of day, and they seemed very reluctant to move during that time of day. And this is when they're just resting for hours. And so they would wait until the fire got close and move a little bit, wait until the fire got close and move a little bit. And I couldn't stand it anymore because this wall of heat was just there. So I had to just walk through the chimps. So I was behind them, but I was closer to the fire. So I just had to walk through the chimps. And they're all looking at me like, what? Because I never, do that. You would try to keep a certain distance and we don't walk purposefully next to them to disturb them. And I just remember they were grooming, and this one male, specifically Frito, who happened to be my favorite, just looked at me and like, how rude, that's how, if it was a person, it would have been like, I don't know.
What are you doing?
Exactly. That's bizarre behavior on your part. And I was just like, I don't know how y'all can stand it. This wall of heat is right here.
And it's probably already hot outside because it's the dry season, right?
Yeah.
And then you're next to this giant fire.
Right.
Oh my
yeah.
gosh.
It's like, what can make things hotter? Well, let's sit by a fire. But yeah, I think usually in the dry season, in the shade, it'll be about between 110 and 115. So that's in the shade. And shade is a hot commodity. That's something that we haven't really published on, but there's strategic use of shade, and there's competition over shade and things like this. And so you don't want to move out of the shade, even if there's a fire coming. But it was just remarkable how good they were at predicting a fire's movement. And I know, for example, people that live and work out in fields and farmers in Senegal are much better at predicting fire's movement than me. But I feel like a lot of us, at least, in the US, have this idea of kind of that Bambi scenario, wildfire, where it is destructive and everything is destroyed and animals are just fleeing in terror. And that was not at all what I saw in this scenario. And again, it's because they have fires. It's just part of their world. But you don't see that in forested habitats, or at least not, like you do at Fongoli. So we started trying to better understand how they deal with fires, what their concepts are. And as an anthropologist, it was really interesting because some people even say that humans' use of fire and making fire is the most unique thing about our species. So there's a lot of things that we use to define ourselves. We have a big old brain, but other animals also have big brains. They have language capabilities, but our use of fire is unique, and especially making fire. And so we started really trying to hone in on different stages of, being able to understand fire and ultimately being able to control it and then make fire. So we use the chimps as a model along those lines. But it is interesting because I've looked for things like, keeping warm next to a fire. So during the dry season, it gets, I would say, cold at night. So, maybe down into the 50s, 59 or so, not really cold.
Chilly.
It is chilly. So if I'm out waiting for the chimps to wake up and there's a burning log because there's been a wildfire and it may burn for,
days,
days, I'll go stand next to that burning log to keep warm. I've never seen the chimps do anything like that. There's been studies of monkeys that are attracted to burned areas. So immediately following a fire, they'll seek out these burned areas and then find burned up insects. And so there was a postdoctoral scholar at Fongoli, and she had studied fire use along those lines in monkeys and investigated whether or not you see it in chimps. And it was really rare for chimps to consume any food that has been burned. It's not unheard of. And I was just at Fongoli in December, and we saw the chimps following a burn, basically, or ignoring a burn. And it was early dry season, so not, too alarming of a burn. But one female, Nickel, stopped and started eating these fruits that had been burned. So basically cooked fruits. And that's what this scientist was interested in, was, origins of cooking and fire. Was fire for warmth? Was it for cooking, light, or all of the above? And so we've really, paid attention to that, but it is rare in chimps. But what we did find, and so in her study, was that they're using these burned areas as travel corridors, which qualitatively it seemed the case, but what she did was track all of the fires one season, and then we had the chimpanzees' movements, and specifically we walked immediately behind a subject and, and saw where they walked. It was at a burned area or not burned area. And so they take advantage of these burned areas, which are easier to walk in, but they also provide these clear areas where your vision, your line of sight is much, much better than in these grassy areas where you literally cannot see for a few feet. So it's interesting. It's something we keep our eye on, but I guess fortunately they don't encounter these very destructive fires, or they either avoid them or don't opportunistically encounter them very often. They probably avoid them is what I'd say.
So I wanted to talk about what some of the challenges are for doing field research at Fungoli.
Yes.
Tell me about the bees.
Oh gosh, the bees. Chimps love honey. I think probably all chimps love honey. I mean, probably most people love honey.
Yeah, who doesn't love honey?
Yeah. And chimps will raid beehives throughout the year. But it seems like it might be more frequent during the dry season. During the dry season, bees are especially aggressive. So that I didn't realize this when I started the project. I know a little bit more about bees now, but bees are more aggressive when it's hotter. It's always hot in Senegal compared to a lot of other chimpanzee study sites, but during the dry season, again, it's really hot. And chimpanzees raid beehives a lot. And most of them are really good at it. I would say it takes a little bit of learning. So youngsters, will hesitate. Sometimes they'll abandon, grabbing honey out of oftentimes it's a hollow tree. So baobab trees usually have a beehive there. And so the chimps will basically grab and run, grab a handful of honeycomb and run. And then the bees are just after that chimp or whatever is around. So if you see the chimps running, basically you need to run, because not just the one chimp that's grabbed the honeycomb, but any chimps around him will run as well, or her. And so it took me a while not to figure it out, but in my mind, so, when you're habituating the chimps, you're getting them used to you, but I was still really conservative and didn't want to, disturb the chimps. When I would see them running, I would think, oh no, were they scared of me? Did I do something? And then bam, I'd get hit by a bee, because they're running from bees. And so it took me a couple years to be able to think bees instead of, somebody scared the chimps. And so once you get stung, then the other bees are going to be attracted to that,
At least as a pheromone to attract the other bees. Yeah, sure. You've been marked.
Right, exactly. And then you really better get out of there. And so I had one pretty dangerous encounter. So there was a chimp that raided a beehive at the bottom of a ravine. And I don't know why I went up, but the chimps were going up and I didn't want to lose them. So I followed them up, and about halfway up the ravine, we hit another site where chimps had raided a beehive.
Oh no.
So
there's already a bunch of angry bees there.
Yeah. So I'm basically crawling up, and I got stung. I think I counted, I thought it was like 30 or 40 times. And gosh. I did feel my throat start to swell up. And when I got to the top of the plateau, I just had to take off running. What was interesting is there's an adult male chimp there, Bandit. And I always have used Bandit as a model. He's an expert beehive. He's an expert beehive raider. And I looked over, and Bandit, his hair was standing up. And so he was either afraid or angry, and he probably was startled by me, but he purposefully did not run. He didn't even startle and move fast. And over time, I keyed in on Bandit especially. And there's this limit at which it's better if you just slow down and don't draw those bees to yourself. So if you're within a certain distance, you need to run. But if you get, say, 50 meters or so, you can just kind of stop or slowly walk, and the bees will continue chasing the running chimps, or in my case, person, right? And so Bandit is very good at judging when it's best to be slow and when is it best to speed up. And I'm not so good at it, but I'm better at it than I used to be. And so there's been so many funny scenarios of me getting stung by bees. but I am better at it. And it's definitely because I watch Bandit a lot to see what he does.
It's amazing that you're learning from the chimpanzees. Yeah, they're teaching you how to survive in this environment.
Yes. And what's funny is there's been we purposefully don't interact with the chimps. It doesn't mean I say they don't read my protocol, so they'll come closer, they'll try to interact with you, ignore them. It's usually a kid wanting to play or something. You ignore that as much as you might like to do that. That's a no-no. We don't play with the kids. But a couple of times there have been chimps that have taken consideration of me before they raid a beehive. And so in one case, I was following this adult male, Bilbo, and he literally trap-lined beehive sites. And I can't remember how many, but it was, between 5 and 10 beehive sites.
Like he knows where each of these beehives is, and he's going from one to the next.
Yeah, he's going directly from one to the next. He left the larger social group, and then we're going from site to site to site. And some of those had no honey anymore. And he gets to one, and he climbs up, and they have this interesting behavior. They're kind of warming up to stick their hand in this hollow, right, and grab honey. And it's almost like someone like warming up to run, like you're going back and forth, your body's moving back and forth. They do this with their arm. They swing it back and forth, and then they grab the honey. Not all of them do it, but Bilbo did it. Bandit does it. He's doing this, and then he's looking at me. And they usually don't look pointedly at the human observer. If anything, they act like they're not looking at you if you catch them looking at you. And I finally realized that it seems like he wants me to move away. And so I moved away. And right after I moved away, then he grabs the honey, and then we both run.
He was waiting for you to move.
He was waiting for me to move because I am so dumb. I'm just standing there, this human, and we know she can't run that fast. I just felt like, so that really endeared him to me. I love Bilbo anyway, but it was just so pointed on his part that he was waiting for me to move, and that he was a better judge of, how fast I could run than I was, I'm sure, or how far away I needed to be. And then we had another male do that as well, but he didn't wait as long as Bilbo. But it was just interesting that they, seemed to care that we didn't get stung by bees, because to me, I'm not sure what they think of us. So I always wonder what they think about me. It's like there's that old one, she trips and gets stung by bees, but she's always there. And after COVID, I came back after 18 months. It was the longest I had not been there. And 2 of the males were just sitting and looking at me, where it's a little unnerving because that's what I do to them all the time, but they don't do that to us. And it was like, are they thinking, is that her? I thought she was dead. I don't know. It was just funny the way they looked at me, because usually when chimps recognize you, there's kind of no reaction. You'll see the first look, and then it'll just go like, oh, she's always been here. It hasn't been 3 months since she's been here. But they also have a fission-fusion social system, so it's not uncommon to have someone gone for weeks and sometimes months, and then come back to the other group.
In our final segment, I'll ask Jill Pruetz what studying chimpanzees has taught her about humans.
To support this Wild World podcast, please check out Autio. It's an app that gives you amazing stories told by some of the world's best storytellers, such as John Lithgow, Phil Jackson, and Kevin Costner, and it's uniquely curated based on your location. It's a perfect audio travel companion for any road trip or just learning more about a trip you want to take. Click on the link in our show notes for more information.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Jill Pruetz about her decades of work studying wild savanna chimpanzees in Senegal.
Can you talk a little bit about what it took to first habituate the chimpanzees to human presence? So when you first went to Fungoli, these chimps were not accustomed to having people follow them around, right? So what was it like to get them used to that process? How long did it take?
So primatologists usually habituate our subjects. So basically it means kind of wearing them down to where it's like, okay, that's a non-threatening thing. It won't go away, but we'll let it follow us. One of the things that you need to do in order to habituate a primate group is to encounter them frequently and encounter the same individuals over and over again. And at Savannah, you have a much larger home range than you do at other sites. So at Gombe, for example, where Jane Goodall began study, one of the a home range is 8 kilometers an area. At Fongoli, it's 85 kilometers. So you have a much bigger area that you need to cover to even find chimps. And chimps have a fission fusion organization. So not every chimp in the group is going to be together at one time, which means that you might encounter Mamadou one day, but then you'll encounter, Bilbo another day. And you want to encounter individuals that get used to you and see you and then, realize you're non-threatening. So that was a big challenge. And I knew it was going to be because no one had successfully habituated Savannah chimpanzees yet when I started the project. Key to our habituation process was water sources. Mbuli Kamra, who was my head researcher at the time, took me around to areas because he grew up there where, chimps use caves. This is where the chimps nest oftentimes. And this is where the chimps come drink during the dry season. And so what we ended up doing was kind of camping out at that water hole, just sitting at the water hole. They would come down this rocky slope and then drink at the base where this seep came out from the rocks there. We would move back if it seemed like they were reluctant to do that. But we had this one old individual that was almost always there, Ross. We named him a funny name to give to the first chimp we identified, but Ross. And Ross, if he was 50, if he was 60, I wouldn't be surprised. He was an old chimp. So his body was just, you get old and you kind of shrink. So he was kind of shrunken, a little stooped as far as chimps go. He had 2 teeth only, and they were both on the lower jaw. So it means he didn't have, chewing surfaces, really just his gums. He was hard of hearing. He couldn't see very good. And either he did not care we were there or didn't see us some of the time. And, we could tell he did see us some of the time, but he spent most of his day at that water source. And so we identified Ross, identify individuals, but then moving from just sitting there in the open and not moving and watching them come down, going from that to be able to follow them, that was a big leap. And so that took a lot longer. But it only took 4 years to get them to the point where we started doing what we call all-day follows. So from when they get up in the morning to when they go to sleep at night is when we follow them.
So can you talk a little bit about the ways in which your work involves the local people, local communities?
So when I started in Senegal, I really had the idea that I work in a national park. But one of my goals, I was a postdoc, was also to do a survey of areas outside the park in Senegal, because there had been a little work done by some French primatologists. There had been some work done by some Senegalese biologists, but there hadn't been a real systematic study done yet. So I wanted to look at these sites outside the national park. And that's when I found Fongoli. And what struck me was that the chimps outside the national park were less afraid of people. And they were afraid. They would leave. But if you saw chimps in the national park, and I think we only saw chimps like 4 times that year. So the chimps just, when they saw humans, it was like, oh, they're out of there. They were gone. And the fear was palpable. When we saw chimps outside the park, they would detect us and then leave. But it was such a different response. I want to say it was almost calm, at least compared to what I saw in the national park. And so I thought that if I studied chimps outside the park, I'd have a better chance of habituating them. So that's why I started at Fongoli. And it really was, probably 6 years earlier than I thought in terms of habituation, getting them habituated. But the people were integral to the project as well. So I got my local permissions from the biggest village in the area. On paper, I needed the forestry department's permission, research permit, which I always do, but couldn't have done work without the local people in the area. And my team has always consisted of So I had Mbuli, who was from the Malinki village we live in. And then I had met up my very first year with Dondo Conte, who's my project manager. So he's been with the project since it started in 2001. He was a researcher out in the field, and now he's a project manager. He doesn't do field work as much. I've always had people from that immediate area. So they're either from a village where the chimps are, overlapping with the chimps, or they're from a village just outside the range of the Fongoli chimps. But I mean, they're incredible. I can't say enough good things about them. And really the local communities, I try to go visit the local elders at the various villages when I'm there. I mean, they've been very welcoming. I couldn't do it without them. But one of the things they say when we have these visits is we're always glad to hear the chimps around the village because we know that the baboons won't be there.
Oh.
Because baboons are notorious crop raiders there, and chimpanzees are not. And so, or at least around Fongoli. And so when the chimps are there, then chimps eat baboons. And even if they're not trying to eat them, there's usually some sort of conflict. And the baboons might win, but a lot of times the chimps are going to win. And so when the chimps are, it means the baboons have to leave. And so that's what they tell me.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's instrumental to have that support. And we live in a village. We also depend on them for meals. We pay them to prepare more when they're cooking their own meals, and they set it aside for us. So that's what we eat at night. And just, logistically, but also the support in general has just been amazing. But it has been really instrumental. And I've tried to give back a little bit. I have a nonprofit that I started, and so we work with different groups of people and also individuals, especially for medical care.
Your nonprofit is Neighbor Ape? Is that
Yes.
the one?
Yeah. So Neighbor Ape, with a nod to, chimps and humans living alongside one another. Medical care has improved tremendously. And for us, like someone living in the US, it doesn't seem costly, but to someone living there, it is costly. And, it's relatively easy for us to pay for medical care. Sometimes it's malaria curatives or healthcare for a woman that's about to have a baby. We pay for someone's surgery, but the costs compared to US medical costs are like minuscule. And so that's something that I can easily do with our nonprofit.
And so if listeners wanted to do something that would be helpful to you in your work and to the chimpanzees, but also the local communities, would making a contribution to Neighbor Ape be a way to do that?
Oh, definitely. Definitely.
So you've spent all this time, being around wild chimpanzees and observing them and studying them. Has any of that changed the way you think about people?
Yeah, I mean, they've definitely taught me about humans, but I have to say what they've taught me about humans, the chimps, doesn't surprise me. Because you can't really appreciate chimps, I think, until you spend time with them. You can't appreciate how similar they are to humans. No matter what you read, a lot of what hits me about chimpanzees is that similar emotion and just communicating with chimps, sometimes not even communicating with them, but just being around them. That is something that's so hard to describe because most people don't have that opportunity. So you're around animals like dogs, domestic animals, but no matter what you read about chimps, I don't think you can appreciate, and other primates as well, but you can appreciate how similar we are as primates to each other in many ways.
So what do you think Fongoli's chimps can teach us about ourselves, about humans?
I think that right off the bat, once the chimps were habituated, they already had us redefining ourselves.
We're no longer the only species that uses tools to hunt and things like that. Yeah,
exactly. I am always cautious about using chimps as a direct analogy to say something about ourselves, living humans, but chimpanzees don't have a really large brain. And the earliest hominins also didn't have a very large brain, relatively bigger than chimps, but not much. So I feel like if chimps are capable of using tools to hunt, navigating a fire, or things like this, provide some sort of context.
So in other words, by studying these chimpanzees, it maybe helps us get some insight into some of those important steps that happened early on in human evolution as hominins started to be more capable of using fire, as they started to use more sophisticated tools for hunting. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So for example, with the hunting, I mean, it's, several million years before we find evidence of stone tool use for early hominins. So we've got bipedal apes, so hominins on the landscape, but you're not going to find a stick tool. It's not going to fossilize. It's not going to preserve in the fossil record. So it's really not until we have evidence of stone tool use that we can say much about early hominins and tool behavior. But if you see chimpanzees who have a relatively smaller brain than these early hominins using stick tools to hunt, I mean, I think it's plausible to say, okay, they were capable at 6 million years ago of exhibiting this type of behavior. And it just kind of opens up your mind, to considering some of these first, when this first happens. But that I think then lends some support that some of these hominins that didn't have a human-sized brain could have been capable of this. And that's always, we've always kind of been stuck on our brain and brain size. And understandably, we have an impressive brain, but I think it helps lend support to some of these hypotheses that are less, human-centric than others.
So we're here at your home in the country, and you've got cows and horses and dogs. You're surrounded by animals. Do you feel like being around animals all the time helps you to better understand chimpanzees?
It's funny because it's almost the opposite, is that I think chimpanzees help me better understand some of these other animals.
Oh, interesting.
Only because I've always had dogs. I've always loved animals. The thing that struck me about chimpanzees is how similar they were to humans, but yet different. But the emotion was so similar to humans. But I will say that, until I moved back to Texas, I never had large animals. So I got a couple of cows when I moved back to Texas. And I always wanted horses growing up. So all I wanted was a horse. Couldn't get a horse. I lived in a small town. That's what my mom told me. I could get one later when I was an adult. But then I traveled too much. I'm always off. I spent on average the first probably 15 years of the project, at least 5 to 6 months in Senegal. So almost half the year I was in Senegal. I don't get to spend as much time, but still I travel. So I was like, I can never get a horse. And then COVID rolls around and my cousin asked if I want a free horse. I'm like, sure, I want a free horse. So that didn't last long. And so now I have 4 different, horses. Well, one's a mule. But it's interesting because as much as I thought I knew about horses, I'd never been around horses, all day. But I find myself thinking about horse behavior in terms of chimps. So sometimes when I describe it, it's like, oh, that was even with my cows once, there was an incident where my pit bull bit the cow on its nose and the cow immediately ran to the other cow for reassurance, which was so chimp-like. And I just didn't expect cows to exhibit that particular behavior. And then she rallied and came after the dog. But I was like, that was so chimpy. And I do that with the horses as well. So it's funny that my frame of thought here is very chimp biased. It's funny how I started learning about these 2 new animals that I have, and from the point of view of chimpanzees.
Well, Jill Pruetz, thank you so much for sharing all of your amazing experiences with chimpanzees and for being here on Wild World.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate it. I'll talk chimps all day long.
To learn more about Jill Pruetz's work with savanna chimpanzees, check out the links in the show notes, or go to our website, wildworldshow.com. We've also got photos of the chimps, including some of the individuals you heard about in this episode. Don't forget to follow us on social media using @WildWorldShow. While you're at it, consider leaving us a rating or a review. You can also email us with your feedback, ideas for new episodes, or pictures of you and your own wild expeditions. We'd love to see them. Our email address is contact@wildworldshow.com. Wild World is produced by 3 Wire Creative. That's it for this episode. I'm Scott Solomon. Join me next time as we explore another part of our wild world.